On Wednesday, in a meeting with Russia's Human Rights Council, Vladimir Putin said of his war in Ukraine, "It's going to take a while." Later, when pressed on the use of nuclear weapons, Putin said Russia wouldn't brandish them like a razor, but wouldn't commit to not using them first, and said that the risk of nuclear war was rising. I wanted to talk to two people who've spent decades studying Russia and who both have new books about the war. Luke Harding is a reporter for The Guardian, and his latest book is Invasion. Owen Matthews is a correspondent for The Spectator and a historian. His latest book is Overreach. They join me now. Luke, let me ask you, because you've been in Kherson, you've been in Ukraine very recently, and you've spent a lot of time there. What is your sense of the state of the war in this sense, which is you always hear about the Ukrainians having extraordinary morale. They're fighting for their country, for democracy, and the Russians don't know what they're fighting for. So when you've been there, this question of the sort of test of morale, where do you think it stands?
I mean, I broadly agree with that. I mean, you talk to any Ukrainian soldier, and they all say the same thing, that they're fighting for their country and for democracy and so on. And the Russians, it's not entirely clear what it's all about. I mean, at the beginning, it was about denazifying, demilitarizing Ukraine. Then it was about saving the Donbass in the east of the country. And recently, we have Putin, as you say, talking about a very long war. But my sense is actually the Ukrainians keep on surprising us. I mean, no one... I was in Kiev on February the 24th, when actually most people thought the Ukrainian capital would fall, including those in the government of Volodymyr Zelensky, many of them. And we've come such a long way in 10 months to the point where actually Ukraine has evicted Russia from half of the territory that it seized. And now my sense is we'll push forward next year and in winter, perhaps in the south, less so in the east. But I think this is a dynamic situation with both sides dug in for the long haul.
Owen, you unusually have been to Russia several times after the war began. What is your sense of the mood in Russia? I mean, obviously, it's a little bit subjective. You're not seeing the whole country, but what's your sense?
You're right. I've been to Moscow 3 times. I was most recently there in mid-October, until mid-October. The bizarre fact of the matter is that there is no sense whatsoever that you are in the capital of a country that is fighting the biggest war of the 21st century. Right up to September 21st, where I was there by coincidence, when Putin took everyone by surprise by announcing mobilization. Until that moment, the war was completely invisible, and actually deliberately so, because in the first week of the war, when I was also there was a little bit of a wave of public patriotism, and that very quickly disappeared. And the state of the Russian people is essentially those who, a small minority, are in despair, and for them the world has collapsed. They've run for the exits. About 500,000, by some estimates, have actually gone to now, to wherever they can get to, basically. But for the vast majority, they're either too poor to leave or too rich to leave. They have too much to lose. And the predominant mood among the elite members, the sort of upper middle class, sort of government-connected bureaucratic people, is sort of quiet despair and denial. And, basically, they just don't want to know.
Luke, what do you think happens? You mentioned that the Ukrainians are now going to push forward, but they are going to start then getting to those parts of the Donbass, which are really... I don't want to say pro-Russian, but have mixed feelings. This is why Russia was able to take them in 2014 so easily, as with Crimea. These are largely Russian-speaking. Many of those people thought the Ukrainian government discriminated against them by not allowing them to speak Russian and things like that. The New York Times had a good story on one of these towns which has just been liberated, where sort of half the people are glad they were liberated and half the people are apprehensive about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's complicated. I mean, first of all, we have to acknowledge that Ukraine is bilingual. So everyone speaks Russian and Ukrainian, and I speak Russian all the time in Kiev, and it's not a problem. And also, like Owen, I covered the moment 8 years ago in 2014 where these sort of Russian-backed militias seized Donetsk and Luhansk. And yeah, there was a kind of pro-Russian constituency, mainly of old people, but others as well. But there were also plenty of people who were pro-Ukrainian, and they were driven out or they've been silenced. Some have left, some have stayed. But I think, I would say, it's interesting listening to Owen about the mood in Moscow. The mood in Kiev now is pretty vehement. So many people have died. So much has been lost. You know, almost 500 kids have been killed. Cities like Mariupol have been pulverized by Russian aviation, by Russian bombs. And there is no mood for dealing, for negotiations with Putin. They're determined to liberate everything. So that includes those areas you're talking about in the east. It also includes Crimea. And I think there's going to be a really interesting point in this war, which we'll reach sooner or later. Let's say Ukraine comes close to Crimea. Is that the point that Washington, whether it's the Biden administration or some other administration, phones up Zelensky and says, look, time to stop and settle? Or because the Ukrainians, I think, are determined to carry on. And it's a question actually for the West. How far does the West back Ukraine? Right up until the end or somewhere short of that?
And Owen, from your sense, and in your book, you spend a lot of time talking about the kind of the mentality that led Putin to adopt these, fairly extreme views on Ukraine. Is it possible that Putin is going to get to a point where he will be willing to negotiate?
I think the issue for Putin is that he just is willing to throw as much at this war as it takes to not lose it, and it's very clear when you talk to people who second-tier people, third-tier people who are in that Kremlin administration orbit. They all assume that the West is going to lose interest. And that's not totally irrational, by the way, because that's what happened before. And that's the problem with this war, is that Putin assumed that the future would be like the past. And in the past, they took Crimea in 2014. A year later, Angela Merkel was signing a $10 billion pipeline deal.